Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. Tonight, we are continuing our series that we started last week on the life and teachings of the Ba'al Shem Tov. I assume most of you were there, but in case someone wasn't, and just as a very, very quick review, if you missed it, you can always watch it on our website, on YouTube. So last week, in very general, we went through the whole life of the Ba'al Shem Tov. He lived for 62 years in what's now called the Ukraine. And he is, of course, the initiator, the founder of the Chassidic movement, a very charismatic, somewhat mysterious person, one of the most influential people in the last 1,000 years in Jewish history, for sure. And we went through his life. He was orphaned. By the time he was age 6 or 7, he was both his father and mother had passed away. And he ended up joining starting at age 8, he was educated by a group of hidden tzaddikim who were just that. They were hidden, but they acted for the benefit of Am Yisrael, especially in education, in supporting people, in educating people, in giving people strength and hope and confidence and determination to hold on to their Jewishness. And where I'm going to add now is we saw he was born on Chai Elul, the 18th day of the month of Elul, in 1698, and he died in 1760. And he was born on Chai Elul, and that date became a very, very important date throughout his life. At age 16, Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet, began to teach him and direct him. At age 26, also on his birthday, on Chai Elul, the spirit of the teacher of Eliyahu Navi was Achia ben Hashiloni. And he began to appear to the Ba'al Shem Tov on his 26th birthday and taught him for 10 complete years. And then again on his birthday, on Chai Elul, when the Ba'al Shem Tov was 36, he directed the Ba'al Shem Tov that it was time for him to reveal himself. So we see this date in his life was so important. What I want to add here is something that happened before and something that happened after what I just described. Approximately 90 years before the birth of the Ba'al Shem Tov, a great tzaddik, the Maharal of Prague, passed away on Chai Elul, on the very day that the Ba'al Shem Tov would be born, approximately 90 years later. And according to Rav Ginsburg, the teachings of the Maharal of Prague were like the stepping stone, or were the initial spark of the philosophy and the worldview that would be revealed in the Chassidic movement. And so Rav Ginsburg says it's very significant that on the very day that the Maharal of Prague passed away, the Ba'al Shem Tov was born, again, approximately 90 years later, because he was not a reincarnation of the Maharal of Prague, but the Maharal of Prague, we'll say, paved the way for the type of teachings that the Ba'al Shem Tov would reveal in the world. And as we said, at 16, Eliyahu Hanavi appears to him on his birthday. At 26, Chia ben Shaloni appears to him. And then at age 36 on his birthday, he is really directed, commanded to reveal himself. The time had come for him to reveal himself. And he did. And he lived for another 26 years afterwards. And he died on Shavuot. On his 47th birthday, on the Ba'al Shem's 47th birthday, he was sitting and learning with his students. And at a certain point, a big smile comes upon his face, and he closes his eyes, meditates for a moment, and he says, a very, very high soul was just born. And he said, this soul will be very, very special for Am Yisrael. So who was that soul who was born on the Ba'al Shem Tov's 47th birthday? Was the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad Chassidic movement. So here we see four very significant dates. The Maharal passes away, the Ba'al Shem Tov is born, he reveals himself, and then the Alter Rebbe, who was one of the cardinal people to carry on the tradition from the Ba'al Shem Tov, was born on his birthday. So what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to try to fill in and in a certain way give a fuller picture of the life of the Ba'al Shem Tov. After that, we are going to go into the teachings of the Ba'al Shem Tov. We're going to begin with the most general innovations that the Ba'al Shem Tov taught to his students, with the very clear intent that they would carry on these teachings and it would bring something new into Israel. Many, many people have heard stories about the Ba'al Shem Tov, many, many miracle stories. And we discussed that last week, that not every story may be accurate, but what is accurate is the Ba'al Shem had the ability to do miracles and wonders. But many people look at him, because he never wrote anything down, as a very, very mystical, charismatic, spiritual type of person. But the Ba'al Shem Tov, from the time that he joined with this group of hidden tzaddikim, it came out later that his own parents were part of this group. He didn't know that. He was 6 years old when his parents passed away. But later it was revealed to him that his parents were part of this group. And he was very, very intent in his program. We discussed this a bit last week, where at a certain point, he became one of the three leaders of this, we'll call it an underground hidden movement that wanted to better the conditions for Am Yisrael and to rectify certain flaws in Jewish society. And then after he revealed himself and began teaching publicly, he was very, very clear and intentful as to what he was teaching over and what he wanted the students to continue. And so the whole idea of beginning a movement was very much in the Ba'al Shem Tov's mind. And of course, he succeeded to a tremendous degree. Within approximately 10 to 20 years of his death, Chassidus had spread all over Europe, all over Russia, Ukraine, and all over Europe. So he was fantastically successful. So one of the events in the life of the Ba'al Shem Tov that we did not mention the first week, and it's possible that we'll go into greater detail about this, is the Ba'al Shem Tov attempted to come to Eretz Yisrael. In those days, it was highly unusual. It was quite dangerous, quite expensive. Many people started off, remember, we have to remember this is before modern transportation. So to go from Europe to Israel was not a simple thing at all. But the Ba'al Shem Tov, despite the fact that he got signs from heaven that it was not the right time for him to go, he was determined to come to Eretz Yisrael. And without telling all of the stories that are attached to this, he made it to Istanbul. And from Istanbul, he got on a ship to sail to Israel. It was pirated. It was hijacked. And he only came with two people, with his gabbai, his assistant, and his daughter. And this will mention more the importance of his relationship with his daughter, who is called Udal. The Ba'al Shem had two children. His firstborn was Tzvi, and then he had a daughter, Udal. And we will talk more about this. But one of the reasons that he wanted to come to Eretz Yisrael is in his Ruach HaKodesh, in his divine providence. He saw that a very great soul had just emigrated to Israel from Morocco. He was called the Orach Chaim. The Orach Chaim, he's named after the book that he wrote called the Orach Chaim. And he had heard that he had moved to Israel, and the Ba'al Shem felt that if he could get together with the Orach Chaim, they together could bring Mashiach. And that was a great part of his impetus to try to make it to Eretz Yisrael. Hopefully, we will be able to go back over some of these stories. But like I said, tonight, I just want to kind of round off some of the details that we left off. After his unsuccessful attempt to come to Eretz Yisrael, when he came back to Europe, shortly after he moved to Mezhebush. And there became his headquarters. And in a certain way, at least in the first few generations, Mezhebush was like the epicenter of the Chassidic movement. And the Ba'al Shem Tov is buried there in Mezhebush, and his Beit Midrash still exists. It's been refurbished, and restored, but it sits on the same place, and it's the same design as the original Beit Midrash. And I had the great privilege one time to be in Mezhebush and to visit the grave of the Ba'al Shem Tov and to daven Shachrit, the morning service, in this Beit Midrash. It was very, very special. So Mezhebush became the headquarters of the Chassidic movement, even after the Ba'al Shem passed away. In the beginning, that was the headquarters of the Chassidic movement. Okay, so since we mentioned Udal, we'll start with his son. After the Ba'al Shem Tov passed away, his son Tzvi became the head of this new, it was really a very new movement. At that point, the fame of the Ba'al Shem Tov had spread far and wide. But his close Talmidim was a relatively small group. But from these really hand-picked students of his, they spread out, and we'll see in a second, under the leadership of the Maggid of Mezrich. So his son Tzvi became the Rebbe of this nascent movement for a year. And from his own initiative, he saw that the Maggid of Mezrich was a much better person to lead the movement. And he stepped to the side in great humbleness, and the Maggid of Mezrich became the leader of the Chassidic movement. He led the movement for, I believe it was approximately 11 years. But in those 11 years is when the Chassidic movement began to spread like wildfire. And a lot had to do with the teaching, the personality, and the leadership of the Maggid of Mezrich. So here I want to tell the story of how the Maggid came to be attached to the Ba'al Shem Tov. The Maggid of Mezrich was a genius, a Talmudic scholar in his own right. And in fact, what he had heard about the Ba'al Shem Tov did not find favor in his eyes. He didn't, let's say he wasn't turned on to the different teachings or the word of mouth of who this person was, a miracle worker, a healer. And so he didn't pay any mind to the Ba'al Shem Tov. It turns out that the Maggid had very, very poor health most of his life. And sometimes he was very challenged to just carry on. And people started to suggest to him, why don't you go to the Ba'al Shem Tov? He's known as a great healer. Maybe he can heal you. And at first, the Maggid did not want to hear this. But as his health deteriorated, he decided that he would go to the Ba'al Shem Tov. And he went to the Ba'al Shem Tov, and just in short, his first impressions, he was not very impressed. At first, the first thing he sees is the Ba'al Shem Tov is talking with women, which in those days, especially for a Rebbe, was not really accepted. And the Ba'al Shem Tov, he reached out to everyone. And then the Maggid heard the Ba'al Shem Tov tell these, what he considered very, very simple, uncomplicated parables that didn't impress him at all. And he was about to leave. And the Ba'al Shem Tov understood what was happening, and he saw the great light in the potential of the Maggid. And as the story goes, he calls him into his room, his study, and he asks him, do you know how to learn the Zohar? So the Maggid said, yes, I learned the Zohar. So the Ba'al Shem Tov gave him a piece to learn. He said, let me hear you teach this, learn it. So the Maggid read it and explained it in a somewhat scholastic, dry manner. And the Ba'al Shem Tov then said, okay, let me try to give it over. And I don't remember the exact piece, but it had to do with the higher worlds and angels and what's called the workings of the chariot. But as the Ba'al Shem Tov was reading and explaining, so the Maggid experienced the words coming to life, that the room filled with angels. He felt the mystical experience of what's called the workings of the chariot. And then he understood that the Ba'al Shem Tov was coming from a place that he had no experience with. And he became really the primary student of the Ba'al Shem Tov. And even though the Ba'al Shem Tov's son took over, it was clear to everyone, including his son, that the rightful inheritor and the right person to spread these teachings was the Maggid of Mezrich. It just turns out that my grandmother, Alea Shalom, came from Mezrich. And I don't know very much, and I really didn't get the history from her, but I know when she came from the old country and she emigrated to the United States, she came to Cleveland. And as was very, very common then, people would tend to settle in places where people from the old country had already settled. So it turns out that many people from Mezrich in the early 1900s had settled in Cleveland. And when my grandmother moved there, she became part of a group, and they stayed together their whole lives. It was a community of Mezrich people in Cleveland. So now back to his daughter, Udal. So here again, as we said, the Ba'al Shem Tov would speak with women, would advise women, would heal women. And he had a very, very special relationship with his daughter. Udal, after the Ba'al Shem Tov died, many, many people treated her like a Rebbe, that she was taught by her father. He didn't hold back anything from her. And when he went to Israel, other than his assistant, his Gabbai, the only person he took was his daughter. So we can imagine what kind of a level she was on. And she gave birth to 3 children. One was Moshe Chaim Ephraim, and he wrote a book called Degel Machnei Ephraim. This was the Ba'al Shem's grandson. The encampment of the flag of Ephraim, like in the desert, how each tribe camped by their flag. And he was also very, very responsible for many of the traditions handed down from the teachings of the Ba'al Shem Tov that eventually made it to one of the major books, the Keter Shem Tov, the crown of a good name. And in this book, many of the teachings that were handed down by the students, and then to his generation, because he was a grandson, so were recorded in in Keter Shem Tov by his grandson. That was the first of Udel's children. Then she had Fega. Fega is the mother of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov was the great-grandson of the Ba'al Shem Tov. And her other son was Baruch, and he remained in Mezhebush, and he became known as Baruch of Mezhebush. He became a very, very famous Rebbe in his own right. And so all three children of Udal were very, very instrumental in the spread of the Chassidic movement and the teachings of the Ba'al Shem Tov. It is said that the Ba'al Shem Tov had a book of healing, of cures. Just one second. Yeah, it was called a book of remedies. I guess in English, it was called a book of remedies. And he gave it over to Udal. And so after the Ba'al Shem Tov died, many people came to Udal for healing. And most of these remedies were herbal. And just like today in alternative medicine, and even in vitamins and minerals, are really based on the herbal world. So the Ba'al Shem Tov was an expert in healing using the natural the natural world. There's a tradition that when the Ba'al Shem Tov was not traveling, now first of all, we have to know that before he revealed himself, he was traveling extensively for this hidden group of tzaddikim. And they would go from village to village and help set up education for children, encouraging people, teaching adults, making sure that their physical needs were being met, encouraging people. As we discussed last week, the Ba'al Shem Tov was born into a very, very difficult time of Jewish history. The vast majority of Jews were dirt poor, were very unlearned. There was a whole class of scholars, but the vast majority of Jews were not that learned and could barely put food on the table. And the oppression of all the host countries in Europe was horrendous at that time. Just one decree after another, one pogrom after another. It was very difficult times. So this group of hidden tzaddikim, their purpose was to encourage people to hold on. So he traveled extensively. And he also sequestered himself in deep heat bodedut, in later, which became famous from his great-grandson, Rabbi Nachman, who made it a pillar of his teachings, this idea of going out into nature and communing with God. So the Ba'al Shem Tov would go out into nature for days at a time, and in really ecstatic prayer and meditation and contemplation and song would just do what's called avodat Hashem, serving God, being close to God, clinging to God, devekut. But after he revealed himself and more students started to come to him, and he saw the tremendous potential in these students, so he he put a lot of time into teaching them. So a version of his ordinary day when he wasn't traveling or he wasn't involved in his own service was that he would go to the mikvah first thing in the morning. that was a pillar of the Ba'al Shem Tov's teaching, is the importance of mikvah. He would pray for a long time, and he would have a minyan with him, and they would pray for many, many hours every day. He would study until noon. He would, on a daily level, do the Zohar on the Torah portion of the week. On most days, he only had one meal a day. He would have an hour of hitbodedut, even when he didn't go out for days at a time. And this is also the precedent for Rabbi Nachman. He would try to do hitbodedut for an hour a day. And then between Mincha and Ma'ariv, he would teach his students, and at night he would receive visitors and consult with people and teach people and learn with people. It's said that he slept in an average of 2 or 3 hours a night, which is true of many of the great rabbis. They somehow could manage with just 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night. He would get up at midnight and do what's called Tikkun Chatzot, a special prayer for mourning over the destruction of the temple. And then Achia ben Shiloni would come to him, and they would learn together. Towards the end of his life, one of his students was Yaakov Yosef of Polonia. And he became one of the closest students. And by nature, he was very different than the Ba'al Shem Tov. Very, very different. But he became very attached to the teachings of the Ba'al Shem Tov. And little by little, the Ba'al Shem Tov tried to kind of move him in the direction that he saw the Chassidic movement going. And before he passed away, he gave permission. He was the only one that he gave permission to write down the Torahs that he had heard from him and to gather teachings that others had heard as well. And so approximately 20 years after the Ba'al Shem Tov passed away, he published his book, Toldot Yaakov Yosef. And that was really the first written account of the Ba'al Shem Tov. Last week, we mentioned very, very quickly that approximately 60 years after he passed away, what's called Shivchei HaBesh, in the praises of the Ba'al Shem Tov. And this is a collection of the stories about the Ba'al Shem Tov, not so much his teachings, but his stories, the stories of things that the Ba'al Shem had done. Many of them are what we would call miracle stories, miracles that the Ba'al Shem Tov had done. And as we said, it was 60 years after, and there is a certain unclarity of exactly how these stories happened, and some of them, if they happened at all. Nonetheless, there is a very, very strong tradition that many, if not most of the stories are true in some degree, and maybe in complete degree, and that certainly the Ba'al Shem Tov was on the level to have done many, if not most, if not all of the stories. It could be that all the stories are true. It's just that because it was 60 years later, wasn't exactly sure when 3 different generations tell over the stories, sometimes certain changes get introduced. Towards the end of his life, at the beginning of the class last week, I mentioned that one of the contexts in which the Ba'al Shem Tov was born and lived was he was born approximately 40 years after the false Messiah Shabbatai Tzvi. And this had a very traumatic effect on the Jewish people, because people, again, it was all word of mouth in those days, but word spread like wildfire that Mashiach was here and the redemption was at hand and everyone was going to go back to Israel. And then the Sultan gave Shabbatai Tzvi a choice, either die or convert to Islam. And he converted to Islam. And of course, it shocked the whole Jewish world. Many of his students stuck with him. They came up with all these rationalizations, and they went like underground. But they were still around when the Ba'al Shem was born. And actually, they still exist. There's still a handful of followers of Shabbatai Tzvi that still remain. But in the beginning, the first 100 years, it was like an underground force to be dealt with. And this is part of the reason that once Chassidic movement began to spread, the scholarly part of Am Yisrael was very skeptical. And they were very fearful, and really for good reason. They heard all of these stories about the Ba'al Shem Tov, and they were afraid of another Shabbatai Tzvi. And at a certain point, they, especially in Latvia, they put the Chassidic movement in cherem. They expelled the Chassidic movement from Jewish life. This, of course, was a very, very horrible thing that happened. It led to a huge split in Am Yisrael for many generations, many generations. To this day, there's still a remnant of call it even sharp philosophical differences. But then it was outright battle between the new Chassidic movement, but it was mostly from the other side, that they refused to accept that the Chassidic movement could be a part of the Jewish people. This had, of course, a tremendous effect on the Ba'al Shem Tov in his later years, trying to deal with the opposition that was coming at him and his followers and his students. At the same time, the Ba'al Shem Tov wanted to somehow fix this whole tragedy with the false Messiah. And so he put a lot of energy into prayer and trying to, say, manipulate the spiritual worlds to get beyond that trauma that Shabbatai Tzvi had caused. After Shabbatai Tzvi, another false Messiah arose, who in a certain way was much more radical than even Shabbatai Tzvi. That was Yaakov Frank. And he led a whole group of people into outright uh, we'll just call it sin. They came up with this whole philosophy, which they thought was based on Kabbalah, which permitted everything that was forbidden. And this was during the Ba'al Shem Tov's life. And so it's said that the Ba'al Shem said himself that these two things, his fighting against the remnants of Shabbatai Tzvi, and now this new false Messiah, Yaakov Frank, and being blackballed, expelled, put in cherem, took a tremendous toll on him. And in his last year or two, he became weaker and weaker physically, and many of what he considered his spiritual powers began to wane, and even expressed to his students that if he wasn't in call it top shape spiritually, there really wasn't a reason for him to be in this world. And so starting around Pesach in the year 1760, he became weaker and weaker. And apparently on Lag BaOmer, he told his students that he could tell that he was going to pass away on Shavuot, which he indeed did. He passed away on Shavuot. We will hopefully talk more about the connection of the Ba'al Shem Tov with Shavuot at a different time. Okay. Okay, so now I just want to mention the idea that tradition is the Ba'al Shem revealed to his students that before his soul came into this world, he only agreed to come into this world if he would have 60 students or 60 people around him that would really assist him. And this is based on the idea in Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, where Shlomo Melech says that he had 60 warriors surrounding his bed. Again, this is a metaphor. So the Ba'al Shem Tov also really had a very small group of close students. Again, his reputation and his connection with Jews spread all over. But again, those who really dedicated themselves to attach themselves to what he was teaching with the intent of spreading these teachings was a relatively small group. So there's just many stories of his relationships with these different students and them as a group. This will get into further as well. So a few of the names that stick out was Nachman of Kosov. He became a Rebbe in Kosov. And to this day, there are Kosov Hasidim. There is a shul in Sfat that I used to go to that was from the lineage of Kosov, still called the Kosover Shul. There was Rabbi Nachman of Horodenka, who became very important in the Chassidic movement. His grandson, Moshe Chaim Ephraim, became very important. Pinchas of Koretz was one of his first students. He became a famous Rebbe in his own right. The Slotchever, the Magid Yechiel Michal of Slotchev, also was one of his first Talmidim. And then, of course, the Magid of Mezrich became really the most important. So I want to end tonight with teachings I heard from Rav Ginsburg of traditions as to who was the Ba'al Shem Tov in the level of soul. In other words, for those who know about the Arizal's teaching of reincarnation, every soul has sparks of other souls. It's not the same exact soul that reincarnates from one body to another body, always the same soul. That's more of an Eastern concept. The Arizal's concept was we are part of much bigger soul roots, soul families, and that in each lifetime, there is a thread that connects a soul through all the different reincarnations. But in each life, there will be a different combination of previous souls that come together in a whole new constellation. So there's different traditions who, as we say, populated the body of the Ba'al Shem Tov. Who were the souls that were the sparks in a soul? So what I learned from Rav Ginsburg, that there were 4 components. One was called a new soul. The tradition is that every person who would ever be born comes from Adam and Chava. And so when they ate from the tree, everyone was affected. But there's a tradition that there were not that many, a few handfuls of souls that somehow did not experience eating from the tree. They were from Adam, but they weren't part of eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And they're called new souls. And new souls only come into the world very infrequently. And when they do, they are obviously very, very major personalities. So according to tradition, the part of the soul of Ba'al Shem Tov was a new soul. And this makes perfect sense, is because he innovated a whole new way of looking at Torah. He didn't change any of the laws, but his worldview, his philosophy, what he emphasized, his teachings were very innovative and very new. That is, we're going to start next week. So that is part of the soul of the Ba'al Shem Tov, is a new soul. And it's expressed very much in his life. Another is the following story, that part of his soul was a hidden tzaddik who lived in Sfat. And the story is told like this, that there was a hidden tzaddik who lived in Sfat, and it was determined in heaven that this soul should take a more active public role. He was at an incredibly high level, but he was hidden. No one had any idea who he really was. And so they sent Eliyahu Navi, who was going to tell him that it's been decreed that you should reveal yourself. But what you need to do, though, is, like, this was the test. he didn't know it was a test. But Eliyahu Navi said, but we want to know, what did you do on your bar mitzvah day? And this hidden tzaddik said, I can't tell you. It's between me and God what I did, and it will stay hidden forever. And in a certain way, he passed his test. In other words, he obviously had done something very righteous on his bar mitzvah, but he didn't want anyone to know. He didn't want to reveal it. He didn't want any accolades, any praise. So again, according to tradition, Eliyahu Navi goes back to heaven and says he like passed his test. What are we going to do with him? He really wants to stay hidden. So it was decided that in that lifetime he could stay hidden, but in a future lifetime he would return and he would begin as a hidden tzaddik, but this time the world needs him and he would have to reveal himself. So that is the story that's told of the second component of the Ba'al Shem Tov. The third component is a great sage in Bavel, Sadia Gaon. There was a whole lineage of Gaonim that led the community in Bavel, which at a certain point was the largest community of Jews in the world, was in Babylonia. And Sadia Gaon, he lived approximately in the year 1000, and he is considered to be one of the parts of the soul. It's a bit paradoxical, because Sadia Gaon came out vehemently against the doctrine of reincarnation. And the Ba'al Shem Tov would reveal to people in certain cases who their reincarnations were. And the Ba'al Shem could see. The Arizal was famous for telling people their soul histories. But the Sadia Gaon was very against it. But Rav Ginsburg explains that the word that Sadia Gaon used for reincarnation was not the word that the Arizal used. The Arizal uses the word Gilgul Nishamot. And Sadia Gaon used the word Hataka, which means to move from one place to another. And so what Sadia Gaon was against was more or less the Eastern idea of reincarnation, where the same soul is reincarnated over and over and over again in a different body until it's more like a punishment until it fixes itself. We know from our concept of reincarnation, it could be because of a punishment, but not necessarily. It could be that the generation needs this soul. It could be that a particular person needs that soul. And it could be that the person didn't do anything wrong, just didn't reach their full potential. So they get a chance to just rise higher. And so Rav Ginsburg explains that in a certain way, the Arizal agreed with Sadia Gaon, because he also didn't agree to that type of reincarnation. And then the last component of the soul of the Ba'al Shem Tov was the nefesh of David HaMelech. And this we'll talk more about on Shavuos, because there's a very deep connection that the Ba'al Shem Tov passes away on the same day that David HaMelech passes away. And as we will explain, the Ba'al Shem Tov was infused with messianic energy. And it's a big, big part of his teachings and the movement that he was trying to bring into reality. And so that was the fourth component of his soul, was of David HaMelech. So I just want to end with one story of the Saadia Gaon. And I've heard Rav Ginsburg tell this story a number of times, meaning that he obviously really, really liked this story. And the story goes that once Rabbi Saadia Gaon went to a town where he was not recognized by everyone, and he was offered lodging in a house of one of the community members, who treated him just so wonderfully. He really knew how to do hachnasat orchim, how to bring in guests and how to treat them. And so as the Shabbat ended, the hospitality was over just a few days, and Rabbi Saadia Gaon was moving on, and he thanked his host profusely. And the host was just, so gracious to him. And Rabbi Saadia Gaon leaves. So shortly afterwards, someone comes to the host and says, "How did it feel to have the great Saadia Gaon as your guest?" And the host was like, "That's who it was?" He had no idea. He had no idea that this was the great Saadia Gaon. And so he ran after Rabbi Saadia Gaon, and he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And Rabbi Saadia Gaon said, "What are you sorry for? You treated me so well. You have nothing to apologize for." And the host said, "But if I would have known it was you, I would have treated you even better." And so Rabbi Saadia Gaon, he told this story over. He said he learned such an important idea. He said that every day we're like new creations. We say it in our morning prayers, that God renews the works of creation every day. We get another chance. The first thing we say is, "Modani lefanecha." Thank you, God, for restoring my soul. It's a whole new ball game, a whole new day. So Rabbi Saadia Gaon said, every day now, I say to God, I say, if I would have known yesterday what I know now today about you and the Torah, I would have treated you so much better. And so this became like a formula for constant improvement, constant elevation, constant renewal. And that's the part of the Ba'al Shem Tov that became infused in his teachings. These very ideas of constant renewal, constant growth, constant getting closer to Hashem. So we'll end with a blessing that we all can follow in Rabbi Saadia Gaon's footsteps, in the Ba'al Shem Tov's footsteps, and every day should be a new opportunity to come close to Hashem.